Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third and final external webinar for the 2021 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. Today's briefing will be a general overview of the outlooks for the Greater Mississippi, Souris River, Red River of the North, and Great Lakes basins. Today's presenters are myself, a hydrometeorologist from the National Water Center, and the Service Coordination Hydrologist or Senior Hydrologist from the 5 River Forecast Centers. Jim Knoll from Ohio Basin River Forecast Center, Mike Welvert from North Central River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, James Paul from Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Grashel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. This webinar is being recorded and a follow-up email will be sent on how to access that recording. If you have a question during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into that question box that you see on the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address it at the conclusion of all of the presentations. We'll start this afternoon by taking a look at the winter precipitation over the Greater Mississippi Basin so far this season and how it compares to last year, as well as highlight what changes we've seen since the last webinar 2 weeks ago. So starting off with those overall seasonal differences, we do still see a big difference between this year in that center graphic compared to last year in the graphic on the right. So this year, below normal precipitation can be seen across most of the Greater Mississippi Basin, but portions of the Central Plains and Lower Ohio Valley are now slightly above average for the season, as is typical in a La Nina pattern, which we are in now. Since the last webinar ago, a mostly dry trend has continued in middle portions of the Mississippi Basin, with the exception of that system that brought some rainfall to the region yesterday, which you can see in that graphic on the left there. So portions of the lower Mississippi Valley and into the Ohio Valley have seen above average precipitation over the last 2 weeks, as well, as you can see in those blue colors that I have circled in that graphic. We move on to the next slide and take a look at temperatures now. In that graphic on the left, still focusing on the last 2 weeks. A big change can be seen from last webinar, where most of the basin was much below average temperatures. We're now much above average temperatures for the last 2 weeks, especially in the northern portions of the basin, which I have circled there. So not only has it been mostly dry over the last 2 weeks in those northern portions of the basin, which we saw on the last slide, but also warm as well. Looking at that graphic in the middle, the basin's temperature averages are now a little split for the season, with above average temperatures in the northern portions of the basin and just slightly below normal temperatures across southern portions, mostly due to that cold snap that they saw last month. Overall, though, so a pretty big change from this time last year, as you can see in that graphic on the right, where most temperatures were above average across the entire basin. Moving on now to this next slide and taking a look at snowfall. In the graphic on the left, you can see the snowfall percent of mean from the last 2 weeks. So very little snowfall occurred over the Greater Mississippi Basin, which makes sense given the warmer and drier departure from averages that we saw on those previous slides. The seasonal percent of mean this year, seen in that middle graphic there, is still below average in the northern third of the basin, which is different from from last year around this time, as you can see in the graphic on the right, where snowfall averages were above normal. Portions of the Central Plains have seen above average snowfall this year, which is also different from last year. And then in the lower Mississippi Valley this season, you can see that we're much above average for this year. And that is, again, due to that series of winter weather events that we had in January and February there. However, all of that snow in the central and southern portions of the basin has melted, which we can see on this slide, looking at the current modeled snow water content. So the primary difference compared to last year is that we have a lot less snow water content across the upper Mississippi Valley. So although we did have some snow melt yesterday in northern Wisconsin following that rain on snow event, we are still holding on to some snow up there for now. Another thing I did want to draw your attention to here, though, is how different this looks from 2 weeks ago, when we were still holding on to a lot of snow water content in the upper Midwest and into the northern Ohio River Basin. That snow has since melted due to those warmer temperatures I showed and several rainfall events. And as a result, many streams across the region have been elevated. Now looking at the soil moisture across the basin, Overall, drier soils can be seen compared to last year. We are still seeing some pockets of elevated soil moisture content, especially in southern Arkansas and northern Louisiana there. But all in all, a much different story from last year, particularly in the upper Mississippi Valley, where soils were saturated last year. And this year, soil saturation is near normal to even much below normal there across North Dakota, which speaks to just how dry it's been. These relatively dry conditions do show up on the US Drought Monitor, which we see here. This Drought Monitor was released today, March 11th, showing that moderate to severe drought I alluded to in the northern and into the central plains. So very different situation from last year at this time, looking at the graphic in the bottom lower corner there, where virtually no drought existed across the Mississippi Basin last year. So this may help to mitigate any widespread significant flooding across the northern and western portions of the basin this year. Now taking a look at the USGS 7-day stream flows, most of the Mississippi Basin is experiencing near normal stream flow, as you can see in the greens on that map. A little bit of a flip from the last webinar, you can now see a distinct above normal pattern across the Mississippi Valley and into the Ohio, and that's a result from that heavy rain that they saw there last week. As we saw earlier, we also observed a lot of snowmelt in the upper Midwest over the last 2 weeks, in addition to that rainfall yesterday. So there are some much above normal stream flows present there and in the central plains now as well. We do still see some white sections on this map in the upper Midwest and northern plains. That's where seasonal gauges are still not taking measurements, but with the exception of northern Minnesota there, you do see greens and blues indicating that where there is flow, it is normal to above normal. I just wanted to point out, while we have seen some recovery to the stream flows across the basin since the last webinar, it's really important to remember that much of the western half of the basin is still experiencing that moderate to severe drought. So that, in consideration with how dry the soils are compared to last year across the basins, does suggest that the western half of the basin has more capacity for that springtime rainfall, which could help mitigate some of the flood threat across that region. However, in eastern portions of the basin, where drought is not present, we will need to monitor that closely in the coming weeks, as several more events are on the horizon for that region, bringing rainfall to potentially already saturated areas. So Jim Knoll from Ohio River Forecast Center will dig a little deeper into this later in the presentation. This next slide is showing us the amount of flood storage capacity the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has within the Mississippi Basin. So still plenty of room flood storage wise right now, but the biggest changes I wanted to bring your attention to since the last webinar are some decreases in flood storage capacity after that heavy rainfall event across the region in the last 2 weeks. So most notably, the upper Mississippi River was previously at 2%, is now at 15%. Along the upper Ohio River, that was previously at 1% and is now at 21%. And at the Yazoo River, previously at 10%, now at 26%. So releases at these locations are occurring to try and lower those levels before the next rainfall event, which we will talk about here in a minute. Moving on to this next slide, elevated water levels have been an ongoing issue in the Great Lakes. So we did want to highlight this again. This information comes from the Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District. So this is based off of the March forecast, which was just released last week. And this covers 6 months spanning from March to August. So all of the statistics that we see on this slide for each lake are based on the most probable forecast. So overall, all of the lakes, with the exception of Lake Ontario, are forecast to be above average, but below record high levels. Lake Ontario is forecast to be slightly below average over the next 6 months. This is important because flooding of those inland streams and rivers could be slower than normal to drain into these lakes if they're elevated. And storm systems that come through this spring have the potential to cause erosion and lakeshore flooding as well. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the weather and climate outlooks that will influence our river outlooks going into the spring. So the biggest story here for the next 7 days in the Mississippi Basin will be more rainfall from the lower Missouri Basin through the mid-Mississippi and into the lower Ohio Basin, which I hinted at earlier. So Widespread 3 to 7 inches of rainfall is forecast over the next 7 days, and that's as multiple waves of moisture continue to push across this portion of the U.S. So although we saw the flood storage availability within the Mississippi Basin on that Army Corps of Engineers slide previously, this rain is expected to prolong ongoing flooding and cause some new and renewed rises from the lower Missouri and into that middle Mississippi, lower Ohio region. So the river forecast centers will touch on this later in the presentations. Now, if we move on to look at the week 2 outlook from the Climate Prediction Center here, probabilities do favor below normal temperatures across the far western portions of the basin, and then near normal to above normal temperatures as we move east into the Ohio River Valley. Probabilities in week 2 also favor below normal to normal precipitation across much of the greater Mississippi Basin. Looking out a little further at the latest seasonal outlooks, these are taking us through May. Probabilities do favor above normal temperatures across the majority of the United States, and as is common in a La Nina pattern, which we're in now, probabilities also show that above normal precipitation chance will shift north into the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region. So this will be extremely important to watch, as those convective rainstorms in the spring could bring the potential for heavy rainfall and also lead to localized flooding, possibly exceeding the current outlooks that you see here today. Finally, we're going to transition from our weather and climate outlooks into how this is all expected to impact the hydrologic outlooks for the spring. So on this slide, you can see there is a low to medium risk of significant flooding across the basin this spring. The flood risk is near normal or below normal for much of the basin, with the exception of portions of the Ohio River Basin where the flood risk is above normal. Ultimately, the frequency, intensity, and extent of this additional springtime rainfall that we get will determine the final outcome of the flood risk for this spring. I'm now going to pass it over to Jim Knoll, who will discuss the potential of flooding this spring across the Ohio River Basin.
All right, thank you, Katie. And if we go to the next slide, we wanted to review, we had a pretty significant, we were talking about that 2 weeks ago, a pretty significant flood event. Possibly our biggest flood event for the Ohio Basin has already occurred. We had widespread moderate to even major flooding from portions of Kentucky and the lower Ohio Basin up to West Virginia. Most of the Ohio River downstream of Point Pleasant experienced minor flooding, though we did have some moderate flooding in several locations, including Cincinnati, Ohio, for a brief time. If we move on to the next slide, so with that flood event that we had about a week and a half ago, this is what is left. We have some minor to moderate flooding in the lower Ohio Basin, southwest Indiana, southeast Illinois, western Kentucky, lower Ohio River itself, that continues to translate down into the mid-Mississippi Valley right now. And the other thing is that storm system pretty much removed any ice, and most of the snow is gone. We do have a little bit in the Allegheny Basin in the upper headwaters of the Ohio Valley, as well as a little bit still lingering in northeastern West Virginia. If we move on to the next slide, so in response to that, south of the Ohio River, we see the blues on the USGS streamflow that Katie was alluding to earlier. Basically, we have above normal streamflows along and south of the Ohio River, and pretty much normal to the north of the Ohio River, though we do have some slightly below normal streamflows in the upper headwaters of the Ohio. That's still where that snow is melting out. That'll continue to green up to normal conditions up there. And then we do have a little bit of below normal streamflows beginning to pop up in the far northern reaches of Ohio and Indiana, where we have basically missed a lot of that rain over the last couple of weeks. If we move on to the next slide then, one thing that our Ohio River Forecast Center soil moisture model is showing, those areas in blue are wet, the areas in green are think of it as normal, and the areas in orange are a little bit below normal. So except for the extreme northern portion of the Ohio Basin into the Lake Erie drainages, most of the area is normal to above normal stream flows right now, thanks to the significant event about a week and a half ago. So if we move on to the next slide. So not a lot has changed in our outlook. Again, I did mention that the event we had a week and a half ago may have been our biggest event. It's not 100% certain by any means, but that was a pretty significant event. We saw some record floods in Kentucky. We took out some of our gauges, some of the USGS gauges went underwater. So it was a very significant event, especially in the Kentucky Basin. So we are still expecting widespread minor to some moderate flooding in the Ohio Basin. The one thing that is we're able to hone in a little bit more than we did a couple weeks ago. The primary area would be about the western half of the Ohio Basin now. Looks to be the greatest threat from western Ohio and Kentucky westward, though it could nose into West Virginia still because just of how wet it got there a week and a half ago. So we do expect the moderate flooding to be really contained in the lower Ohio Basin with at least a 50% chance of occurring. And those are pretty high numbers because we're depending on rainfall now. So it's all rainfall driven. And so when you see flooding threats at 50% or greater, that takes a lot when we're only dealing with the rain. We don't have that snow component really anymore to drive things. If we move on to the next slide, again, not much has changed. The 25% or greater probability of flooding continues to show pretty widespread possibility of minor to moderate flooding. Again, especially in the western half of the basin, could nose still again into West Virginia. You see the primary concentration of that significant flood threat of moderate or major would be in Kentucky, southern Indiana, and southern Illinois. If we move on to the next slide, let's hone in just a little bit. A couple of things I will note is some changes since 2 weeks ago. We did drop the Maumee Basin in northeast Indiana since they missed the rainfall. We are in our big spring rain season, so without that rainfall and with the snow gone, the probabilities have greatly decreased in northern Indiana for flood threat. But we continue to expect at least a 50% probability of minor flooding in the Wabash, the East Fork of the White, and the White River Basins across the state of Indiana and along the Indiana-Illinois border. Further to the south, in the lower Wabash and Little Wabash Basins, we expect minor to moderate flooding across portions of southwest Indiana, southeast Illinois. One addition we've made is that we've added a moderate flood risk for the Patoka River Basin in southwestern Indiana. Moving on to the next slide and shifting down into Kentucky and Tennessee. A few things have changed here. We've added the Licking and Little Sandy Basins with at least a 50% chance of minor flooding over the next 90 days, taking us into the month of May. We continue to have at least a 50% chance of renewed minor flooding in the Kentucky River Basin in central Kentucky. And then in western Kentucky, we are expecting at least a 50% chance of minor to moderate flooding throughout the Green River Basin of western Kentucky. Shifting over to Ohio and West Virginia on the next slide, we continue to run the risk of some Lake Erie shoreline flooding and erosion from any windstorms this spring, especially typically late March and April is the primary threat season with those north to northwest winds that could cause some flooding right along the shoreline there. We continue to expect some minor flooding in the Maumee side of the basin in Ohio. So even though we removed Indiana for the Maumee Basin, we continue to have some risk for minor flooding in the Ohio side where it's not quite as dry up there. In central Ohio and east central Ohio, we do expect some minor flooding in the Muskingum and Killbuck Creek basins. And in south central southwestern Ohio, along Ohio Brush Creek. It's wet down there from those rains a week and a half ago, so we still expect at least a 50% chance of minor flooding in south central southwestern Ohio. And then finally in northern West Virginia along the West Fork, we do expect some minor flooding. If we move on to the next slide for the Ohio River itself, well, again, I told you that we did have minor flooding really along all of the Ohio River from West Virginia down through Ohio, Kentucky, along the Ohio River, and into southern Illinois. Going forward, now that flood wave has passed, we do expect minor to moderate flooding in the lower Ohio Basin, at least a 50% chance below Louisville. And even if we look at the 25% chance it's really below Cincinnati. So the flood threat is really contained now, it appears, to the lower half or the western half of the Ohio Basin for the Ohio River itself. So moving on to the next slide, I do want to talk a little bit about the short term. We do have, as Katie said, we do have a series of events coming in over the next 10 days. But again, the shift of the next event, unlike a week and a half ago, appears to be more the western, or what we call the lower Ohio Basin, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, western half of Kentucky, where we do expect some between a 30 and a 70% chance of seeing minor to moderate flooding. If we move on to the next slide, another way of looking at this is over the next a little over 2 weeks, we are expecting widespread 1 to 2 inches of rainfall in the Ohio Basin, but that is normal for this time of the year. The area where we do expect heavier precipitation in the 3 to 5 inch range is in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, southwest Ohio, and Kentucky, possibly sneaking down into northern Tennessee. And that is where our above normal flood risk really into the spring continues. If we move on to the next slide then. So in summary, we are expecting additional minor to moderate flooding in the Ohio Basin this spring. It's primarily focused now in the southwestern half or lower half of the Ohio Basin. We cannot rule out isolated major flooding, especially in southeastern Illinois, southern Indiana, and Kentucky, where they've already experienced a wet condition over the last 30 to 45 days. As I mentioned earlier, however, the worst flood of this winter-spring season may have already occurred. Again, it's common to see minor to moderate floods in the Ohio Basin in late winter and spring, but we saw a significant major flood event actually that did occur. Therefore, flood risk is above normal in the following areas. We're able to hone in a little bit more than we did 2 weeks ago. We're expecting that above normal risk now in the Ohio Basin to be focused on southeastern Illinois, southern Indiana, far southern Ohio, western West Virginia, and Kentucky. Elsewhere, the flood risk is now considered normal for those northern, eastern, and southern areas of the Ohio Valley that were not mentioned above. That includes the Cumberland Basin tracking down into Tennessee. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike now at the North Central River Forecast Center.
All right, thanks a lot, Jim, and thanks, Katie, for setting the stage for us. We'll go to the next slide here. I'm going to start out by looking at the soil moisture. Katie already showed the drought monitor, but I wanted to throw it up here once again. The area continues to be rather dry. Most of our service area is experiencing drought or abnormal dryness. Of course, with the recently melted snow now, the topsoil has become a little bit wet at the moment, but overall the soil profile remains very dry at this time. So that is something to keep an eye on here for this spring, and it plays into our flood risk. In the next slide, we're going to take a closer look at the snow water content that's still out there on the landscape. The warm weather we had the past several weeks has melted the majority of our snow across our service area. Satellite imagery and the interactive snow information webpage here both indicate that only snow of any magnitude that remains is confined to northeast Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern lower Michigan, and in the Upper Peninsula. The greatest snow depth that we see is up across the Upper Peninsula. The remainder of the region has less than 6 inches. There's a few spots, of course, that have snow on the north-facing slopes and in some sheltered areas, and that's sticking around. But that's rather limited in how much water that it actually is going to contribute to the runoff at this point. We also did get some snow yesterday and overnight from South Dakota up into western Minnesota. But again, that's not going to contribute a whole lot of water either, we don't think. There's actually going to be more impact from the 1/2 inch to 1 inch of rain that fell. That was in a stripe all the way from South Dakota across much of central Minnesota. The water equivalent in the snow that does remain is 1 inch or less most everywhere across our area, with the exception of a few isolated spots up around 2 inches or so in the Minnesota Arrowhead, northern Wisconsin, and maybe a part of northern lower Michigan, as you can see there. The Upper Peninsula still has 5 to 8 inches of snow water in the typically snowy areas in the lee of Lake Superior. On the next slide, I grabbed a couple of satellite images to show where the snow was still on the ground. So this is a satellite image taken on Monday around midday. Note that all the snow on the landscape still exists there in northeast Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. And we also have a band of snow from northeast Iowa across southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. If you recall from past outlooks here, we were really watching that area because that was where the heaviest snowpack was. It's kind of hard to make out the state boundary lines on here, so I crudely drew in the state of Wisconsin as a reference. So don't criticize my artwork too much there. So that was Monday. The next slide is going to look 24 hours later on Tuesday. And we had those warm temperatures. As you can see by that next day, a good portion of the snow that ran from Iowa into Wisconsin is melted. It's a little harder to see with the clouds, but it looks like the majority of that snow is gone. You can also see that there's less snow up across central into northeast Minnesota as well. And then we got the rain yesterday, and looking at satellite imagery today, I didn't put it in the slideshow, but when I'm looking at it today, it's confirming that pretty much all that snow there across the Wisconsin-Illinois border region is now gone. So how has our outlook changed as a result of all this? Let's look at that on the next slide. Overall, our risk for flooding looks to be substantially less than usual for the remainder of this spring. And the risk from snowmelt alone is very small. Where flooding does have a greater than 50% chance of occurring, it appears the most likely outcome is going to be minor flooding. And that's denoted by the orange icons you see. There are only 3 points that indicate a 50% chance or greater probability of reaching the moderate level, and none that reach major. In the past two outlooks, we've been watching the area from eastern Iowa over to the Chicago, Milwaukee areas, as I said. So let's zoom in on that area one more time in the next slide here. So our concern for potential flooding continues to be where the heavy snow band was, and also we saw that that was melting or has already melted. Elsewhere across the area, we do see quite a number of orange icons on the screen, a few reds. So we do have a risk for flooding in this area, at least a 50% chance for reaching flood stage. But again, most of this flooding, if it occurs, is expected to remain in the minor category. Some of the river systems that could be impacted by this include the Rock and Illinois rivers, as well as the mainstem Mississippi River and some of the smaller tributaries that feed those. Parts of Missouri into southern Illinois are also of concern, as they received quite a bit of rain, as Jim mentioned from the previous event that they had. It also looks like they're going to be getting quite a bit more here in the next few days. Day 3 through 5 forecasts are now showing quite a bit of rainfall, and Jim kind of alluded to that in his outlook, and so did Katie as well. So if we get flooding in those areas, we're going to be watching closely the Merrimack River Basin in eastern Missouri and also into southern Illinois, affecting rivers such as the Big Muddy. So with our snow mainly gone now, it seems kind of prudent to include a look at the 25% chance for flooding in addition to this 50. As you can see from the colored icons, the primary concern area is still over the southern part of our service area, Missouri, Illinois, and also that area from eastern Iowa over to southern Wisconsin. So basically what this is telling us is that with the current elevated river levels, along with wetter soils and future rainfall events, that will give us more of a chance to result in flooding for those areas. And if flooding does indeed occur, most of it does look like it's going to stay in that minor variety. But we do have up to 30 locations that are indicating a potential to reach the moderate flood level. Perhaps one could reach major as well. So let's take a look now at frost depth one last time. The frost is all but gone for the southern part of our area. We still do have some frost up across the north. The frost is deepest across North Dakota, where it's still 3 to 4 feet down. Frost depth of 1 to 3 feet is seen from northern Minnesota into northern Wisconsin, but the remainder of the area is a foot or less, or even gone altogether. Reports that we've been getting from across the region are kind of confirming what we had speculated in our earlier outlooks. Dry soils and limited frost depth seem to really limit the amount of runoff that we got. Usually when we have melting snow, there are large puddles and standing water that we see in low spots, farm fields and ditches and such, but there's been very little of that seen this year. So it does seem that a great deal of the water has actually soaked in, as we thought might happen. River rises are occurring though, as some of the runoff has made it into the waterways, but overall the rises seem to be much less than what we see in a typical spring melt season so far. Our Forecast office here is already issuing forecasts for around 55 locations as a result of the snowmelt runoff and yesterday's rain. And we're also including expected rainfall now in the next few days. But even this 55 is a lower number than we usually see in a spring season. So on the next slide, we'll talk about the summary. Our risk for flooding from this point forward is going to be tied to future precipitation events. Not a lot of snow left for us to be worried about at this point. The outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, as Katie showed, for the next 6 to 10 days is showing near or colder than normal temperatures and precipitation around normal or above normal in some spots. And the expected temperature trend continues to be colder than normal for the remainder of the month of March. Precipitation also probably near normal. So looking at all of this, our flood risk for the remainder of the spring season appears to be about normal or even below normal in many areas. And if we do get any flooding, it should mainly be of the minor variety. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Kevin Lau, the Service Coordination Hydrologist at Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. Flood risk for this spring remains below normal for the Missouri River Basin. Next slide, please. The right-hand graphic here is the probabilistic 90-day stage distribution for the Missouri River at Leavenworth, Kansas, and it serves as an example of the departure or the gap between historical, the blue line, and today's condition, the black line. And so what this right-hand graph hopefully shows is that conditions on the ground today result in a decrease in the chance to reach flood stage here at Leavenworth of about 24% as compared to normal. Historically, Leavenworth has roughly a 52% chance of hitting flood stage, but this spring it has only a 28% chance of hitting flood stage, a reduction of 24%. On the map on the left, Leavenworth would show up as a teal dot, the colors depicting the departure from historic for each of the 470 some odd forecast locations in the Missouri Basin. So as can be seen on the left-hand map, locations can be found throughout the Missouri Basin having anywhere from a 10 to over 50% reduction in flood risk. Now, mind you, there are a handful of locations, such as those orange dots that are in central Missouri, that have a 30 to as much as a 50% increase in flood potential. And so this blanket statement that the Missouri Basin has an overall decrease in flood risk doesn't hold for each and every forecast location, but it is the general trend. Looking at the mountains, this graphic is courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and it shows the mountainous basin snowpack conditions in terms of percent of average snow water equivalent. That is the amount of liquid that's held in the pack. Mountain snowpack ranges from slightly above average in the northern Rockies to below average in the south. And so overall, we are saying mountain snowpack is about average. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated about 80% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountains. And so while things could still change, the mountain snowpack runoff contribution for 2021 is coming into sharper focus. And speaking of the mountain runoff contributions, the next slide shows the March water supply forecast that was issued on March 2nd by our office. And it's graphically summarized here in this graphic. And our March water supply forecast illustrates this graphic illustrates a below average mountain runoff season. And the season is defined as the April through September volume. Significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone is not expected. Moving now to the plains, as I believe Mike and Katie both mentioned, a recent system just dropped a fresh blanket of plain snow across portions of Wyoming, the panhandle of Nebraska, and into southern South Dakota. And this is depicted here on this graph courtesy of the National Weather Service Office of Water Prediction. However, as Mike said, this plain snow contains very little liquid, trace to maybe at 1 inch. And so it really doesn't contribute to the flood risk. Overall, the Missouri River Basin is pretty much devoid of any appreciable snowpack. I'm now going to move state by state through the Missouri River Basin, highlighting those areas that are projected to have a better than 50% chance of experiencing some level of flooding over the next 3 months, that is between now and mid-June. Beginning here with Iowa, minor flooding is still expected along the Little Sioux River, highlighted here in yellow, here in northwest Iowa. Moving south and west into Kansas, moderate level flooding is likely along Stranger Creek, highlighted here in red in northeast Kansas, and the Little Osage River, shaded in red in the southeastern portion of Kansas. Minor flooding is expected along the Big Blue, the Black Vermilion, and the Meridicine Rivers, all shaded here in yellow. Moving eastward into the state of Missouri, and this will be the last state that I will discuss, a very long list of rivers expected to see flooding this spring. And in fact, and this is nothing new, it's very typical for this time of year for these tributaries. In fact, some of these rivers have already witnessed 2 rounds of flooding just in the last part of January alone. And as Mike and Katie mentioned, over the next 5 to 7 days, several rounds of precipitation are expected to impact the lower 2/3 of the Missouri Basin, including the state of Missouri. And for Missouri, this will come as rain. The heavy rainfall expected over the next several days will most likely lead to minor and moderate flooding along many of these Missouri tributaries shown here. Finally, I wanted to break out the lower 800 miles of the Missouri River main stem on a slide of its own. And we are expecting that the Missouri River below Kansas City to see minor flooding over the next 3 months. So in summary, for the Missouri River Basin, we expect or are projecting a lower than normal spring flood risk. Mountain snowpack is near average. We've still got roughly 20% of the accumulating season left, so we're getting a fairly good feel for what the mountain contribution will be this year. Flooding due to mountain snowmelt alone is not expected. The Missouri River Basin is pretty much devoid of plain snow, although we did add a little bit over Wyoming, Nebraska, and South Dakota over the last 24 hours. The latest Drought Monitor places 92% of the Missouri Basin in abnormally dry conditions or worse. Northern soils are still cold, but remain porous. So we believe that frozen ground conditions will not play a factor in exacerbating runoff. I did not explicitly mention river ice conditions in my presentation today because river ice concerns are rapidly diminishing. We do still have ice on the rivers in Montana, Wyoming, and in the Dakotas, and some reporting thicknesses of 1 to 2 feet. However, given the absence of plain snow, very dry soils, and low stream flows going into freeze up, the risk for river ice breakup jamming is overall lower than normal for most of the northern and western portions of the Missouri Basin. Thunderstorm activity typically drives flooding in the lower basin, and so we are expecting episodic minor to moderate flooding this spring across eastern Kansas and the state of Missouri. In fact, we will likely have flooding in the lower basin by the end of this week. Thank you. This concludes the flood potential for the Missouri Basin, and I will now turn the presentation over to James in the Arkansas Red.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. Since we started this year's briefings about a month ago, on my first slide, most of the ABRFC has been in a dry spell. As this 30-day percent of normal precipitation graphic shows, there have only been a couple of areas that have received above normal precipitation in that time. This includes east central Colorado and central Arkansas. Otherwise, most areas are running at less than 50% of normal. But that will change somewhat with the heavy rainfall systems that have already been mentioned that are already moving into the area and will continue through the weekend in the northeast half of the basin. But I'll get to that shortly. On the next slide, We see the snow water equivalent in the mountains of the upper part of the Arkansas River in Colorado and New Mexico. The percent of normal, as determined by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, is about 90% for the entire area, but as you can hopefully see, the range for the smaller watersheds within the larger basin is from around 40% to 100%. In this area, the snowpack typically reaches a max in the mid to latter half of April. We do expect to see some additional snow in this area this weekend, so numbers should go up. But at this time, we don't expect the snowpack to be a significant contributing factor to potential flooding later this spring. With the ongoing drought in this area, we continue to call for below normal flood risk on the Arkansas River upstream of Pueblo. The next slide shows the status of the Corps and Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs in our basin with respect to the amount of flood storage being used. With the relatively dry weather, the Corps has been able to keep flood pool usage to a minimum. In the Arkansas Basin, most lakes are using none or less than 5% of their flood storage. In the Red Basin, a couple of lakes are using 10 to 15%, but most have all or almost all of their flood storage available. With the expected rainfall this weekend, we will need to watch how these levels are affected, especially in the Arkansas River watershed. Speaking of the ongoing expected rainfall, on the next slide, we see the forecast rainfall through next Tuesday morning, with widespread 2 to 7 inches expected across the northeast half of the basin. When we put this rainfall forecast into our river forecast models, the resulting graphic on the right shows which river forecast locations could be affected, with the Spring and Neosho rivers in southeast Kansas, northeast Oklahoma, and southwest Missouri most likely to see flooding. However, with not a lot of active vegetation growth yet, any locales that receive heavy rainfall will be susceptible to flooding this weekend. Moving on to our long-range forecast, we see a few more locations with a greater than 50% of at least minor flooding have been added. The ones that we are most concerned about include the Neosho and Spring rivers in southeast Kansas, northeast Oklahoma, and southwest Missouri again, along with Bird Creek in northeast Oklahoma, and the Illinois and Poto rivers in eastern Oklahoma. All of these indicate a greater than 50% chance of minor to moderate flooding. Those individual forecast points in the central part of Kansas and Oklahoma that are showing a 50% or greater chance are reacting to the potential heavy rain this weekend and will probably not have as high a probability this time next week once the rainfall has moved out of the area. Finally, in summary, we expect some minor or possibly moderate flooding in the northeast part of the basin this weekend. In the long term, we expect to see some flooding on rivers that normally flood each spring, but in general, we continue our outlook for a near normal flood potential across the Arkansas Red Basin. The lone exception is in central Colorado, where the flood risk is below normal for the Arkansas River upstream of Pueblo Lake. And as this weekend's rainfall event is reminding us, in our part of the country, the extent and severity of spring flooding are really predicated on the timing, location, and strength of any convective storm systems we may get at this time of year. And with that, I'll pass it along to Jeff Brushel at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
All righty, thank you, James. As far as the Lower Mississippi River flood outlook, we right now still have minor to isolated moderate flooding occurring over the lower Ohio and the lower Mississippi rivers, and that's really due to all that heavier rainfall that Jim talked about in the Ohio Valley. It's still working its way through the system right now. We also have minor flooding that's still occurring over portions of Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana, again, just from rainfall that we've had over the past week. Switching to the next slide and talking about the lower Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers, we really got the lower part of the Ohio is finally crested now. We've had a very broad crest here over the last several days, and right now kind of cresting conditions are around the Tiptonville area of Tennessee. It's probably going to take another 10 to 11 more days before the peak of the rises make its way down to New Orleans. And again, that's just from all the rainfall we had from almost 10 days ago up in the Ohio Valley. Over the next 7 days, though, as James was talking about the heavier rain that was going to fall over the Oklahoma and Kansas area and extends eastward into the Missouri and northern parts of Arkansas area. That rainfall from that particular event that we're looking at for the end of this week and weekend is really going to fall behind the cresting conditions that we have now on the river. So what that will probably do is just keep areas, especially on the lower part of the river, kind of elevated and prolong the flooding for a few more weeks. So the potential for minor to isolated moderate flooding is possible for the winter and spring for the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers. Switching to the next slide and talking about Arkansas and Missouri, like we said, we do still have flooding conditions right now in the lower parts of the White and the upper parts of the Ouachita basins in Arkansas right now. And all those locations are in recession, but with the heavier rainfall that we're anticipating here over the next several days and stuff, we could get some possible minor to some isolated moderate flooding, especially over the northern parts of Arkansas and southern parts of Missouri. And for our long-range forecast, we're still looking at minor to isolated moderate flooding for the winter and spring. Switching over into Tennessee and northern Alabama, things have receded quite a bit. We really don't have a whole lot of flooding that's currently going on in these areas now. But with the rainfall that we did have over a week and a half ago, we still see that we could get potentially some minor and moderate flooding across these areas over the next several months. Really have seasonal conditions in these areas as we speak at this time and stuff. But again, just as we know, heavier rainfall that we may get here over the next few days could give us some minor and moderate flooding. And again, that's true for the rest over the next several months. And then working our way down to Louisiana and Mississippi, we still have minor flooding occurring in portions of tributaries going into the Red River and then the upper portions of the Calcasieu River in Louisiana. No flooding is occurring right now in Mississippi at this time, but heavy rain that we're expecting over the next few days may possibly get us some minor flooding in the very upper reaches of the Yazoo Basin in the northern part of Mississippi. And the potential for minor to isolated moderate flooding is possible again for the next several months. And then finally to the summary slide that I have, the risk is really near normal that we're looking at for the lower Mississippi and Tennessee valleys right now. Most of our area, as far as the lower Mississippi, lower Ohio, and the Atchafalaya Basin, and all the smaller tributaries in the lower Mississippi Valley are really expecting minor flooding with some isolated moderate flooding, which is very typical for us for this time of year. And again, as everyone else has already mentioned, the rainfall will really be the indicator of what the final outcome of the flood risk will be for this winter and spring. With that, I will turn it over to Katie.
All right, thank you so much for those great presentations to each River Forecast Center. So before summarizing these presentations, I wanted to remind everybody on the line to please utilize that question box in the GoToWebinar GUI if you have any questions for our presenters today. So in summary, across the greater Mississippi Basin, near normal to below normal flood risk is expected, except for portions of the Ohio River Basin and stretching back to eastern Iowa where an above normal flood risk does exist. Significant flooding due to mountain snow runoff alone is not likely due to the below normal snowpack, as Kevin Lau from Missouri Basin stated. And again, as everyone has stated, that springtime rainfall and its frequency and intensity will ultimately determine the final outcome of the flood risk for this season in the greater Mississippi River Basin. It looks like we have one question that came in for Kevin Lau. Kevin, the Platte River is forecast to have 15 to 30 inches of new snowfall this coming weekend. How much do you project this will affect the snowpack water supply percentage and the potential for flooding?
Okay, can you repeat that, please, Katie?
Yes, absolutely. So the question states that the Platte River is forecast to have 15 to 30 inches of new snowfall this coming weekend. How much do you think that will affect the snowpack water supply percentage and the potential for flooding?
I doubt that it will affect the flood risk. However, I probably should take the water supply question under consideration and get back with the person after the call with regard to that. I don't think I can answer that right off the bat.
Okay, we will. The question was from Bob Bacon, and Bob, Kevin's email is in here. It's just kevin.lau at NOAA.gov. So you can see that in the slides that I sent out as well if you would like to follow up with him.
Okay, thank you so much, Katie, and thank you for the question. I'll get back to you.
All right, we'll give it another minute here, see if we get any other questions in. Okay, not seeing any more questions. So again, thank you all for your participation in today's webinar. As I said previously, this is the last scheduled external webinar of this series before the National Hydrologic Assessment release next week on March 18th. So this recording will be distributed via email. And remember, each RFC's contact information can be found in these slides, so don't hesitate to reach out if you have a question. Thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone.